imagine for a moment that you've spent your entire life preparing for one just singular sacred journey.
Right, the absolute pinnacle of your spiritual life.
Exactly. You've saved your money for decades. You've, walked for months across these unforgiving, scorching deserts. You've braved bandits, starvation, exhaustion, all to fulfill your ultimate spiritual obligation.
You stand in the holiest city on earth.
Right. But so when you finally crest the hills and you look down into the valley of Mecca, you don't find this thriving beacon of divine order. You find a ghost town.
Yeah, it's a completely jarring image.
You walk into the city limits to discover ruined buildings. The streets are controlled by extortionist warlords, and the central sanctuary, the Kaaba itself, is heavily damaged. And the black stone, like the most sacred relic you traveled all this way to touch.
It's gone. It's been physically chiseled out of the wall and stolen.
Stolen. I mean, it sounds like the plot of a bleak alternative history novel.
Yeah. It really does. But that was the actual harrowing reality for pilgrims arriving in the Hijaz, which is the western coastal region of Arabia during the 10th and 11th centuries.
So welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive into the sources you've selected for us today. Our mission here is to really pull back the curtain on a deeply misunderstood era of history.
Yeah, we're looking at the Arabian Peninsula in the centuries right after the explosive rise of the Islamic Empire.
Right, because there's this incredibly stubborn assumption out there. People assume that once the political capital of the Islamic world moved out of Medina, first up to Kufa in Iraq, then over to Damascus under the Umayyads, and eventually to Baghdad under the Abbasid dynasty, that the Arabian Peninsula just kind of quietly faded away.
That it turned into this sleepy, irrelevant museum of a bygone era.
Exactly. But looking at our sources, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Not at all. The narrative we're tracing today is one of profound turbulence, really intense ideological warfare, and these bizarre sociological mutations.
We're going to examine how two vastly different regions of the peninsula actually survived the departure of that central government. First, we'll look at the Hijaz, the cradle of Islam containing Mecca and Medina, which basically found itself trapped under the crushing weight of its own sacred symbolism.
And second, we'll head south to the Yemen. This rugged, fiercely independent territory that proved geographically and socially, practically impossible to conquer.
So the story really begins with this fascinating paradox in the Hijaz. Let's look at the mechanics of what happens when a massive, world-spanning empire moves its headquarters.
Right, the economic impact.
Yeah. Usually, if the politicians, the heavy hitters, the royal court, if they all leave a city, the economy crashes. The money follows the power, right? But I was looking at these sources, and they claim the exact opposite happened to Mecca and Medina.
It's so counterintuitive.
The political power vanished, but the region experienced a massive economic boom. How does that actually work?
Well, it really comes down to the sheer unprecedented scale of the early Islamic conquests.
Yeah.
So during the time of the Rashidun caliphs, the first four successors to the Prophet, and then continuing under the Umayyads, the empire was expanding outward at just a staggering rate.
They were taking over huge chunks of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires.
Exactly. And the economic engine of that expansion was built on sending a massive portion of the spoils of war back to the origin point. We're talking about the wealth of entire civilizations flowing directly back into the Hijaz.
Gold, silver, textiles.
All of it. And it was sent back to support the families of the early conquerors and the descendants of the Prophet's companions who stayed behind.
Okay, so it's basically this massive influx of global tribute. But, you can't eat silver. If the population of Mecca and Medina is swelling because of this new wealth, they need food. And the Hijaz is famously arid. So where is all the logistical support coming from?
That is where the central government stepped in to essentially subsidize the survival of the holy cities. They established a massive state-sponsored supply chain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Grain and provisions were shipped across the Red Sea from Egypt, which, was the breadbasket of the ancient world.
Right.
They developed significant port infrastructure on the western coast of Arabia. Ports like Al-Jar and Al-Shuqayba became these vital beating arteries. And later, under the Caliph Uthman, the main maritime hub was actually shifted down to Judah.
Which you might know today as Jeddah.
Exactly.
But relying entirely on shipments from Egypt is risky, isn't it? If a storm sinks your grain fleet, Medina starves. Did they try to build any local self-sufficiency?
They did, and the way they achieved it was, it was through a massive forced labor economy.
Ah, the darker side of imperial expansion.
The sources detail really extensive agricultural development in the Hijaz during this time. We were talking major infrastructure projects, the construction of new dams to catch flash floods, digging deep wells, establishing complex irrigation systems, and even introducing new crops.
But wait, who was actually digging these wells and working this arid land? Because I'm guessing it wasn't the wealthy descendants of the companions?
Definitely not. This entire agricultural boom was built on the backs of prisoners of war.
So as the armies are conquering territories in the north and east, they're funneling captive populations back to the Hijaz to serve as agricultural labor.
Precisely. The influx of this captive workforce allowed completely new settlements to simply emerge out of the desert. Towns like Al-Rabada became thriving hubs entirely because of this imported labor and injected capital.
Wow.
The administration streamlined tax collection, they set up milestones, they built road stations. So you have a society overflowing with imported wealth, sustained by imported food and captive labor, but crucially, this is the key point, entirely decoupled from the day-to-day burden of running the state.
Which creates a very, very unique socioeconomic environment. Because, I mean, if you have immense wealth, immense religious prestige, and absolutely zero administrative responsibilities,
Yeah.
what do you do with your time?
You build an intellectual court. That's the major sociological shift that happened in the Hijaz during the first 2 centuries of Islam.
An intellectual court. I love that term.
The descendants of the Prophet's companions, living in Medina and Mecca, essentially formed a powerful leisure class. Without the distraction of drafting treaties or, managing armies, they dedicated their lives to codifying the heritage of the Prophet.
So because the capital moved to Damascus, the scholars in Medina actually had the time and the funding to invent formal Islamic law.
That's a great way to put it. This specific environment is the incubator for what we now understand as classical Islam. It's here that heavy-hitting scholars, figures like al-Zuri and Malik ibn Anas, whose teachings form the basis of the Maliki school of jurisprudence, were able to really flourish.
They were doing the foundational work.
Right. They were gathering the hadith, which are the recorded sayings and traditions of the Prophet. They were compiling the sirah, the biographical accounts of his life. They were debating complex theology and laying down the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence.
But, reading the sources, what really struck me was that it wasn't just men with long beards sitting in austere mosques debating theology all day. Because when I think of Mecca and Medina, I naturally assume a deeply pious, solemn, strictly religious atmosphere.
Sure, that's the modern assumption.
Right. But the wealth created something else, too. There was a huge boom in poetry. There was a thriving music scene. People were hosting vibrant, luxurious social gatherings.
It is a brilliant contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
The exact same wealth that funded the rigorous scholarship also funded a highly sophisticated cosmopolitan culture.
Yeah.
You had patrons sponsoring poets and musicians. There was an elegance and a luxury to life in the Hijaz during this specific window that feels completely at odds with our modern perception of a purely austere religious sanctuary.
But wait, human nature is human nature. If I am the great-grandson of one of the foundational figures of this empire, living in the very city where the religion was born, it has to sting watching the Umayyad caliphs up in Damascus calling all the shots. Especially when maybe they don't have the same pristine religious pedigree that I do.
Oh, absolutely. The resentment was palpable.
Surely the local elites resented losing their political relevance, no matter how good the poetry and music were.
They definitely did. And it wasn't just ideological grumbling either. It manifested in fierce economic warfare.
Economic warfare, how so?
Well, the prominent local families, specifically the Alids, who were the descendants of Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and the Zubayrids, they realized that if they couldn't control the armies in Syria, they could at least control the ground beneath their feet. So they began aggressively buying up land.
They pivoted from politics to real estate.
Exactly. But highly strategic real estate. They poured vast fortunes into buying and developing massive tracts of agricultural land in places like Fadak, and particularly Yanbu, which is an area to the west of Medina.
Okay.
Yanbu became incredibly prosperous. In fact, by the 4th century or the 10th century CE, the sources indicate Yanbu was actually more prosperous than Medina itself.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the mechanism here. By monopolizing the local agriculture, these elite families are basically making themselves indispensable. They are building an independent economic power base right under the nose of the distant caliphs.
You've got it perfectly. And the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus were acutely aware of this threat. The Alids and the Zuberids became the most potent domestic opponents of the central government.
It's a really volatile mix. They had the moral high ground of their ancestry, and now they had the independent wealth of their vast estates.
Which puts the central government in a terrifying bind. I mean, if you're sitting on the throne in Damascus or Baghdad, you have the military, you have the imperial treasury, but you desperately need a Hijaz.
Right. If you don't control the holy cities, your entire claim to be the legitimate ruler of the Islamic world just collapses.
Exactly. So how on earth does a distant caliph try to manage a region packed with wealthy, resentful aristocrats who technically have a better claim to the throne than he does?
Yeah, how do they?
Through a bizarre, anxious, and constantly shifting system of administration. If you look at the administrative maps of the Hijaz over this period, they are chaotic. The central government simply did not know how to handle the region.
I noticed that in the sources, the borders keep moving.
Right. Sometimes Mecca, Medina, and the agricultural hub of Taif were bundled together under one supreme governor.
But then, like a few years later, they would randomly split them up. Suddenly, Mecca has its own governor and Medina has another.
Yeah, and sometimes they would attach the Hijaz to the Central Arabian province of Yamama, or even tether its administration all the way south to the Yemen.
Why keep redrawing the map? What does that achieve?
It is a classic strategy of preventing any local power base from solidifying. If you keep changing the jurisdictions, you prevent alliances from forming between the regional cities.
Oh, that makes sense. Divide and rule by bureaucracy.
Exactly. And you see this paranoia reflected perfectly in how the caliphs handled the governors themselves. Typically, they would appoint members of the royal family, their own brothers or cousins, or highly trusted aristocrats to govern the holy cities.
Which seems logical. You send your most loyal guy to hold the most critical symbolic territory. But the sources point out that these guys served incredibly short terms. Like, if I trust my cousin enough to make him the governor of Mecca, why am I firing him or moving him 2 years later?
Because the environment in the Hijaz is politically radioactive. If your cousin stays in Medina for 10 years, he might start marrying into those wealthy Alid or Zubayrid families.
Oh, right.
He might start making backroom deals. He might realize that he has the holy cities, he has the local wealth, and hey, maybe he should be the caliph. A governor who goes rogue in the Hijaz is a nightmare scenario for Baghdad.
So, the caliphs just played endless musical chairs with the governorships. Keep them rotating so no one gets comfortable. I see the logic.
But the ultimate tool of control, the real focal point of this entire political dance, was the annual pilgrimage. The role of the Emir al-Hajj, the leader of the pilgrimage, seems to be the most critical political appointment of the entire year.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a modern equivalent for this. Imagine, like, the Olympics, the State of the Union, and the Vatican's Easter Mass all rolled into one single event. Hundreds of thousands of people travel from the farthest edges of the empire, from Spain to Central Asia. They all converge on Mecca.
It's an unimaginable crowd.
Right. And whoever stands at the front of that mass of humanity and leads the rituals is effectively projecting their power to the entire known world.
That is precisely what it was. Leading the pilgrimage is the ultimate, undeniable public performance of sovereignty. Usually, the governor of the holy cities would lead it, unless the caliph himself made the journey or deliberately appointed a high-profile proxy.
And the caliphs definitely weaponized this appointment to send geopolitical messages, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. There is a brilliant example of this from the later Abbasid period. The Caliph al-Qadir deliberately appointed a man named al-Radiya to be the Emir al-Hajj. Now, al-Qadir was a Sunni caliph, but al-Radi was a prominent Ali Shiite leader.
Wait, a Sunni caliph deliberately chose a Shiite leader to direct the most important Sunni religious ritual of the year? That seems wildly counterintuitive.
It does, until you look at the broader geopolitical chessboard. At this time, the Abbasid Empire in Baghdad was facing a massive existential threat from the Fatimids.
The Fatimids being the rival empire based in Egypt.
Right. And the Fatimids adhered to Ismaili Shi'ism. They were actively trying to muscle their way into controlling the Hijaz. So, by appointing a moderate, local Shiite leader as the Emir al-Hajj, the Abbasid Caliph was essentially driving a wedge into the opposition.
He's basically telling the local Shiites in the Hijaz, look, I respect your leaders, I give them the highest honors, you don't need the Fatimids to champion your cause.
Exactly. It was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver to conciliate the moderate Shiites and block the Fatimid expansion. Pure political theater, played out on the holiest stage in the world.
And speaking of the stage, the caliphs didn't just manipulate the people, they manipulated the physical space itself. The architecture of the holy cities literally became a battleground for legitimacy.
That's right. During the early days, under the Rashidun caliphs, changes to the infrastructure were purely practical. When the Caliph Umar enlarged the mosques, it was simply because the sheer volume of pilgrims had outgrown the space.
He built watering stations and food storehouses just to keep people from dying on the road.
Yes, but as we move into the Umayyad era, starting with Muawiyah, the philosophy changes entirely.
Muawiyah starts sending luxury items from Syria. Special incense, imported candles, a custom-made cover for the Kaaba. It shifts from practical welfare to, like, imperial branding.
And it escalates dramatically under the Caliph al-Walid. He ordered massive, breathtaking renovations of the Prophet's mosque in Medina. We are talking about the introduction of magnificent mosaics, gold, silver, ivory, and imported marble.
Wow.
He completely transformed it from a simple communal gathering place into a towering imperial edifice. He even assigned a special militia whose sole job was to guard the mosque.
A dedicated security force just for the building. I mean, that is a very heavy-handed projection of state power.
He went even further. Al-Walid ordered that a formal mosque be constructed at every single location where the Prophet was historically known to have prayed.
Wait, really? Every location?
Every location they could identify.
He is physically paving over history. He's making sure that everywhere a pilgrim walks, everywhere they look to connect with the divine, the very first thing they see is the wealth and authority of the Umayyad state.
It is architectural imperialism. But as you can imagine, this did not sit well with the locals at all. The people of Medina pushed back fiercely.
I read that sometimes they literally just barricaded themselves in their homes. When the imperial architects came to tear down adjacent houses to expand the mosque, the locals simply refused to leave.
Because to them, it wasn't just about losing their property, it was a spiritual violation. The local scholars looked at these glittering Byzantine-style mosaics and gold columns, and they were horrified.
Right, because it goes against the core values.
Exactly. To them, this luxury was a grotesque deviation from the austere, simple path of the Prophet. They viewed the central government's gifts as a deeply corrupting influence.
And the government didn't just stop at the buildings. They started trying to dictate the kinetic movement of the worshippers inside the space. There's an incredible detail in our sources about the governor Khalid al-Khazri during the Marwanid period. He introduced a new rule during the Tawaf.
Yes, the Tawaf is the central ritual of the pilgrimage, where the faithful circumambulate walk in circles around the Kaaba. It is a dense, physically overwhelming, deeply communal experience.
And up until this point, everyone did it together, right? It was just a unified mass of humanity.
Correct. But Khalid al-Khazri used his authority to enforce a strict physical separation of men and women during the Tawaf.
Let's really think about the mechanics of that. You have thousands of people swirling around a central point, caught up in religious ecstasy, and the state steps in and says, no, we are going to regiment your bodies. We are going to partition the crowd.
It's a huge shift in control.
Yeah, that isn't just a modesty measure. That is an unbelievable flex of state authority. The governor is essentially declaring, I don't just own the marble you're walking on, I dictate the very manner in which you are allowed to worship.
And while that particular spatial innovation regarding crowd control remained, other impositions were violently rejected because you have to remember the context we've just built.
Right.
You have deeply resentful, incredibly wealthy local elites. You have paranoid rotating governors. You have an imperial center trying to buy submission with gold mosaics and forced architectural changes. The Hijaz was an absolute powder keg.
And eventually, that struggle for legitimacy snapped the most fundamental religious taboo in Islam: the prohibition of bloodshed in the sanctuary. For anyone listening who might be unfamiliar, the concept of the Haram, the sacred sanctuary of Mecca and Medina, is foundational. It is supposed to be the ultimate safe zone. You cannot hunt, you cannot cut down trees, and you absolutely cannot spill human blood.
It's sacrosanct.
But the historical reality, and this is what's so shocking in these sources, is that this sanctity was repeatedly shattered. And the most startling part is that it wasn't outside invaders doing it. It was mostly Muslims fighting other Muslims.
When the stakes are total political control of the empire, religious taboos often crumble. During the Second Islamic Civil War, the tensions between the Hijaz and Syria exploded. The people of Medina actually organized under their own leadership and drove the Umayyad representatives out of their city.
Just kick them out.
Yes. And the Umayyads responded with a Syrian army, leading to the devastating Battle of Al-Hara in 683, where the Medinans were slaughtered just outside their own city limits.
And the violence physically reached the Kaaba itself. During the Zubayrid hegemony, when the rebel Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr controlled Mecca, the Umayyad armies literally laid siege to the holiest city on earth. They set up catapults on the surrounding hills and bombarded the sanctuary.
It's hard to even picture.
The Kaaba itself caught fire and was severely damaged. How does an army of believers justify catapulting stones at the house of God?
They justify it through the rhetoric of necessity and by completely delegitimizing their opponents. The Umayyads argued that the rebel, Ibn al-Zubayr, was the one violating the sanctuary by using it as a fortress to hide from legitimate state authority.
Look what you made me do on an imperial scale.
Exactly. Each side claims the other forced their hand. But the psychological damage to the broader Muslim community was profound, and the violence only escalated over the centuries. You had radical Kharijite sects seizing Mecca and Medina in 746. You had constant Alid rebellions, like the tragic uprising of a leader known as the Man of Fakh.
That detail really stuck with me. He was killed in 786 while he was literally in the state of Iram.
Yes, Hijra is the sacred state of ritual purity a pilgrim enters before performing the rites. They wear the seamless white garments.
For a rebel leader to be struck down while wearing the very garments of peaceful pilgrimage, it just shows that the political desperation had completely overridden any remaining reverence for the sanctuary space.
The environment was deteriorating generation by generation.
So what happens when we get to the 3rd and 9th centuries?
The bottom falls out. The Abbasid Empire in Baghdad, which had been the central anchor of the Islamic world, began to critically weaken. Their military overextended, their treasury drained, and their grip on the distant provinces slipped.
And when the imperial grip slips from the Hijaz, it creates a massive, deadly power vacuum. And as we know, geopolitics hates a vacuum. If Baghdad isn't sending troops to secure the holy cities, who rushes in?
Outside regional powers, for one. You had the Tulunid dynasty, which had broken away and taken over Egypt, pushing in from the west. You had the Safarid dynasty, a Persian military empire, pushing in from the east. They literally clashed inside the sacred precincts.
That is insane to visualize. It's like proxy wars being fought in the middle of the Vatican Square.
But the internal collapse was even worse. As central authority vanished, nomadic Bedouin tribes from the south and east began pushing into the Hijazi settlements, disrupting trade and agriculture. And this brings us to one of the most tragic sociological transformations in this entire history, the fate of the local Ashraf.
The Ashraf being the descendants of the Prophet's family. Earlier, we talked about them as this highly sophisticated, wealthy, leisure class funding legal scholarship and poetry. What happens to them when the state collapses?
Without the influx of imperial wealth and without a central authority to maintain order, the urban sophistication just evaporated. The various branches of the Prophet's descendants, the Hassanids, the Husainids, the Jafarids, fractured. They transitioned from being urban scholars into becoming local warlords.
Oh.
They adopted the rugged, violent lifestyle of the surrounding Bedouin tribes.
Because, if the government isn't protecting you, you have to protect yourself. And if the government isn't paying you, you have to find new revenue streams.
Exactly. And their primary revenue stream became the pilgrims themselves. The sources note a bitter irony here. These local elite leaders, whose entire legitimacy rested on their blood connection to the Prophet, began preying on the very people coming to honor his sanctuary.
That's incredibly dark.
They fought each other in the streets, they fought the city dwellers, and they routinely extorted and robbed the pilgrim caravans.
I actually read a line in the sources that said these local leaders, the Ashraf, occasionally plundered the Kaaba themselves to strip it of its accumulated wealth. That is a staggering collapse of civic and religious order.
It was an era of total anarchy, and it paved the way for what is arguably the most traumatic event in the medieval history of the Hijaz. The Karmati massacre of the year 930 CE, or 317 of the Hijri calendar.
We mentioned this right at the start of the deep dive. The Qarmatis. Who were they, and how did they manage to pull off the unthinkable?
The Qarmatis were a radical, deeply militant offshoot of Ismaili Shi'ism. They were based across the peninsula in eastern Arabia, near modern-day Bahrain. They operated a highly egalitarian, almost utopian society, but they possessed a fiercely iconoclastic theology.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
To the Qarmatis, the orthodox rituals of the pilgrimage, the walking around the Kaaba, the kissing of the black stone, were abhorrent. They viewed these acts as idolatry, a corruption of true, pure monotheism.
So they don't just want to conquer Mecca for political leverage, they want to ideologically destroy it.
Precisely. During the height of the pilgrimage season, when the city was packed with defenseless worshippers, the Qarmati army invaded. They slaughtered pilgrims by the thousands. They threw the corpses into the sacred Zamzam well to deliberately defile it. They wrecked the
It
infrastructure.
was horrific.
And then, as the ultimate ideological victory, they physically extracted the black stone from the corner of the Kaaba and carted it across the desert back to Bahrain.
Let's just sit with the sheer horror of that for a moment. This isn't just a military defeat. This is a spiritual decapitation. The Black Stone is the physical focal point of prayer for millions of people across the globe. To have it stolen and kept by a radical sect for decades, the psychological shock to the global Muslim community must have been paralyzing.
It was. For a number of years following the massacre, the Hajj pilgrimage actually ceased.
Complete.
No one came. There was no security, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the central relic was simply gone.
To give you a visceral sense of what the Hijaz looked like in the aftermath of this collapse, we can look at the writings of a Persian traveler named Nasir Khusraw. He visited the region in the mid-11th century, and it is a bleak, haunting account.
Very bleak.
He notes that the population of Mecca, which was once this booming cosmopolitan hub, had crashed to just 2,500 people, and a fifth of those were just temporary residents or foreigners.
He describes a landscape of ruin. Many of the great edifices built by the early caliphs had simply crumbled. There was absolutely no central authority recognized. The inhabitants were reduced to desperate survival. He bluntly refers to the locals as robbers and murderers.
He also visits Taif, the city up in the mountains that used to be the lush agricultural breadbasket of the Hijaz. He describes it as a wretched little town.
The intellectual vibrancy was dead. The great historians, the jurists, the poets, they had all abandoned the region centuries ago, fleeing to safer, more prosperous centers like Cairo, Baghdad, or Cordoba. The Hijaz had essentially been crushed by its own gravity.
Because it was the symbolic center of the world, everyone fought to control it. And in fighting for it, they nearly destroyed it.
Exactly.
Which provides a perfect contrasting pivot to the second half of our deep dive. If the Hijaz was nearly destroyed by everyone desperately trying to control the center of the faith, the territory to the south, the Yemen, was defined by its absolute rugged impossibility to be controlled at all.
Yes. If you move down the Red Sea coast from the Hijaz, you enter a completely different geopolitical universe. The Yemen does not have a single massive gravity well like Mecca or Medina. The Yemen is a land of 1,000 shattered pieces.
The geography alone dictates its history. It is staggering. We rely on the accounts of the early 10th century geographer al-Yaqubi, and he attempts to catalog the administrative divisions of the Yemen. He lists 84 distinct provinces. 84.
And these aren't neat little squares on a map. These are profound topographical barriers. You have the blistering, humid coastal plain along the Red Sea called the Tihama. You have the towering, jagged mountain ranges of the northern highlands. You have the central plateau, the deep, isolated valleys of the Jaf, and the massive, sprawling canyon systems of Hadramaut in the east.
It's a nightmare for any central planner trying to march an army through it.
Exactly. If you conquer one valley, the valley 5 miles away, separated by a 10,000-foot ridge, doesn't care.
Sure.
And that fractured geography perfectly mirrors the intensely fractured society that lived there.
The Yemen was the ancient heartland of the Arabian tribes, right?
Yes. Unlike the urban centers of the north, Yemenite society was structured around massive, ancient tribal confederations that predated Islam by centuries. You had the Himyar, the Hamdan, the Madhai, the Kinda, the Azd. Each of these groups possessed deep, localized loyalties, their own customary laws, and fierce martial traditions.
And there was a unique elite class in the capital city of Sana'a as well, right? The Abna?
Yes, the Abna were an aristocratic military class of Persian origin. Decades before the rise of Islam, the Sasanian Persian Empire had intervened in Yemenite politics and left behind a garrison.
Oh, interesting.
The descendants of those Persian soldiers intermarried with local nobility and became the Abna, holding a very precarious dominance over the capital.
Because the Yemen was so remote and so geographically segmented into these impenetrable valleys, it quickly became the ultimate haven for anyone running from the central government. Like if you were an ideological rebel, a persecuted Shiite, or a radical Kharijite fleeing the caliph's armies in Iraq or Syria, you ran for the mountains of Yemen.
It was a sanctuary for dissent. But what is truly crucial to understand about the Yemen in this period is how it interacted with the new religion of Islam. In regions like Iraq or Egypt, the Arab conquests fundamentally reorganized society. But in the Yemen, The pre-Islamic tribal structures survived the advent of Islam entirely intact.
That is a fascinating irony to me because Islam, particularly in its early days, was explicitly designed to unify the fiercely independent Arabian tribes under one faith and one single political community, the Ummah.
Right, that was the goal.
But when it reached the Yemen, it seems like the tribal chiefs simply looked at this unifying religion and decided to use it as just another weapon in their local feuds.
We see this exact dynamic play out during the very lifetime of the Prophet, with a famous historical event known as the Rebellion of the False Prophet, Al-Aswad al-Ansi.
I want to dig into this because the traditional historical narrative usually frames this guy as an apostate. He supposedly abandons Islam, declares himself a prophet, musters a huge army in the year 632, and violently conquers the capital, Sana'a. It sounds like a straightforward religious war.
That is how the later imperial historians categorized it. But modern historical analysis of the sources suggests something very different. It is highly likely that Al-Aswad al-Ansi's rebellion wasn't primarily about religion at all. It was a nativist, tribal uprising.
A nativist uprising against who?
Against the Abna. Remember, the Abna were the Persian-descended elite ruling Sana'a Sana. They were seen as foreigners. Al-Ansi was marshaling the native Yemenite tribes, specifically the Majid Confederation, to overthrow foreign rule.
So religion was just the wrapping paper for a political revolution.
Exactly. In the complex tribal politics of the era, branding your rivals as apostates or claiming divine inspiration was a common way to legitimize a military power grab, even if the root cause was entirely secular and territorial. It was ancient Yemenite politics playing out using the new powerful vocabulary of prophecy and religion.
So the tribal chiefs are just adapting the new rhetoric to fight the old wars. But eventually, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, manages to formally suppress these rebellions and bring Yemen into the Islamic fold. But the stability doesn't last, because the entire demographic makeup of the country is about to change.
Right. The great Islamic conquests of the 7th century required immense manpower. The armies sweeping into Egypt, Syria, and the Persian Empire needed fierce, experienced fighters. And Yemenite men left their mountain valleys by the tens of thousands to join these conquering armies.
They formed the absolute backbone of the early Islamic military machine.
They did.
But if all the young men, the warriors, and the ambitious leaders leave the country to go conquer the world, doesn't that just leave the Yemen an empty, defenseless wasteland?
You might think so, but the sources show the opposite effect. The massive immigration didn't empty the country. It merely vacuumed up the surplus population and the newly appointed Islamic governors who went north to seek greater glory.
Ah, so who was left behind?
The old, entrenched pre-Islamic aristocracy, the tribal chiefs whose power was rooted in land. The emigration actually shifted the internal balance of power back to the traditional tribal leaders, leaving them very much in charge of whatever territory their specific tribe could hold.
It makes me think of Yemen's political landscape like a heavily shattered pane of glass. If you look at it from Baghdad, it technically looks like one single province, one window. But when you get up close, you realize it is made up of hundreds of jagged, disconnected shards.
That is a brilliant analogy.
And every single shard operates as its own micro-universe, with its own alliances, ancient vendettas, and local warlords.
And the tragedy of the imperial strategy in Yemen is that the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs were constantly trying to force that shattered glass into a neat, unified imperial frame. And they usually ended up bleeding for it.
How did the distant empires actually try to manage a territory that refuses to be governed? Because sending a governor from Baghdad to Sana'a seems like sending a guy to be the mayor of a single shard of glass while ignoring the rest of the window.
Historically, they tried to manage it with an incredibly heavy hand, relying on sheer brutality, which routinely backfired. Now, it must be noted that there were brief exceptions.
Right.
The Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, who is famous for his piety, tried a different approach. He recognized the systemic corruption and tried to rule the Yemen with genuine justice. He redressed the grievances, returned confiscated lands, and curbed the abuses of his predecessors. He was deeply revered by the Yemenites for this.
But his reign was short, right?
Yes, his reign was short, and his methods were the exception, not the rule.
Right. If Umar was the carrot, the later Abbasid governors were the stick, a very, very large stick. The sources talk about military governors like Ma'an ibn Zaida and Hamad al-Barbari. These weren't administrators. They were hardened generals dispatched to pacify a rebellious frontier.
And their methods were defined by extreme, almost indiscriminate brutality. When insurrections flared up, which they constantly did, these governors didn't just target the rebel leaders, they enacted collective punishment on the region.
Just punishing everyone.
We are talking about massive casualties. The sources record thousands of people being killed in punitive campaigns across regions like Sada in the north, Al-Janad in the south, and the sprawling valleys of Hadramaut.
But military history tells us that collective punishment in a tribal society never breeds submission. It only breeds a generational blood feud.
Exactly. The brutality guaranteed inevitable massive blowback. For example, Hamid al-Bari's incredibly harsh treatment of the local populations directly provoked a massive revolt led by a powerful Himyarite chief named Al-Haysam around the year 800.
The imperial violence didn't break the tribal resistance. It deepened it, forging anti-imperial alliances between tribes that normally hated each other.
And sometimes that local resistance grew so powerful that it didn't just fight the governor. It went fully rogue and threatened the core of the empire itself.
There is one revolt in particular that blew my mind. The revolt of Talib al-Haq. I mean, first of all, the name alone is spectacular. The one who pursues the truth.
It is a highly charismatic title. His actual name was Abdullah ibn Yahya. He was a figure from the late Umayyad period. And what makes his story so compelling is his background. He wasn't a mountain warlord. He was actually the appointed Qadi, the imperial judge, working for the Umayyad governor down in the remote region of Hadramaut.
Wait, so he is an insider. He's part of the state apparatus.
Yes, but he secretly harbored Kharijite sympathies.
Ah.
The Kharijites were a fiercely puritanical, uncompromising sect that believed leadership belonged solely to the most pious Muslim, regardless of their bloodline or tribe. They despised the dynastic corruption of the Umayyads. Abdullah ibn Yahya openly rebelled, declared himself the true caliph, and took the title Talib al-Haq.
And he didn't just hide in a valley. With the military support of fellow Ibadi Kharijites who sailed over from Oman, his uprising exploded.
It was a tidal wave. His forces swept through Hadramaut, conquered the capital Sana'a, and essentially took over the entire Yemen. But they didn't stop there. They marched an army north, up the coast, and incredibly, they seized control of Mecca and Medina.
Let's contextualize how insane that is. Imagine a local small-town magistrate from the deepest mountains of West Virginia deciding the federal government is corrupt, declaring himself president, and successfully marching a militia all the way to Washington, D.C. to take over the Capitol building.
It's a staggering achievement.
A judge from the deepest south of Arabia managed to take the holy cities and had 30,000 followers swearing allegiance to him as far away as Basra in Iraq. It proves that Yemen wasn't just an isolated backwater. When mobilized, it was a lethal springboard.
It highlights a crucial historical question. How effective is a traditional imperial military against a deeply entrenched, ideologically motivated tribal society? Because eventually, the Umayyad imperial armies did march down, defeated Talib al-Haq in battle, and killed him.
But killing the leader didn't kill the ideology.
No, and it certainly didn't pacify the tribes. The underlying defiance remained completely intact.
And that chronic, unbeatable defiance drove the imperial generals crazy. It led them to resort to some truly bizarre, deeply specific psychological warfare to try and break the spirit of the Yemenites. This is the part of the sources that I had to read twice to believe.
You are referring to the campaigns of the Abbasid general Yazid ibn Jurir.
Yes. The context here is a massive civil war tearing the Abbasid Empire apart. The two sons of the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid al-Amin and al-Mamun are fighting a brutal war of succession. Al-Mamun sends this general, Yazid, down to the Yemen to secure the loyalty of the province for his side. And Yazid realizes he can't just fight them all, so he uses what the sources politely call unorthodox means.
Unorthodox is an understatement. Yazid targeted the social fabric itself. He issued a mandate forcing the Yemenites of Persian origin, the Abna, who we discussed earlier, to literally divorce their Arab wives.
Well, explain the mechanism of that. How does forcing people to get divorced secure a province for a distant emperor?
It is an attempt to forcefully sever the complex web of tribal alliances. In these societies, marriage isn't just a romantic union, it is a vital diplomatic treaty. The Persian-descended Abna maintained their power in Sana'a by intermarrying with the surrounding Arab tribes, creating bonds of mutual defense and shared bloodlines.
Okay.
By legally forcing them to divorce their Arab wives, the generals trying to isolate the Abna, destroying the social bridges that knit the society together so they can't form a unified rebellion against him.
It is stunningly intrusive, but it gets even weirder and somehow more petty. Another appointee of the Caliph al-Mamun was sent to suppress an uprising by the powerful Himyar tribe. He defeats their warriors, but he decides that isn't enough. He orders his imperial troops to march through the valleys and physically chop down all the Himyarite apricot trees.
That detail is profound, and it is devastating. Chopping down an apricot orchard is, on one level, total economic warfare. It destroys their livelihood, their trade goods, and their food security. But more importantly, it is psychological warfare.
Because an orchard isn't like a field of wheat that you can just replant next season.
Exactly. An orchard takes decades, sometimes generations, to grow and bear fruit. It represents rootedness. It represents the legacy of a grandfather passing sustenance down to his grandchildren. By chopping down those trees, the imperial governor is trying to break the deepest psychological spirit of the Himyarites.
It's like he's saying, I don't just control your present reality. I have the power to erase your future.
Precisely.
I can't conquer your mountains, so I'm going to murder your fruit trees. It is a testament to how frustrated and impotent the central government felt. And predictably, since central imperial control relied on chopping down trees and mandating forced divorces, it completely failed to hold the region.
It was unsustainable. And as the Abbasid Empire's grip finally slipped away entirely in the 9th and 10th centuries, the shattered glass of Yemen reorganized itself. Local dynasties and unique religious enclaves rose up to fill the void, creating socio-political structures that you simply did not see anywhere else in the Islamic world.
Let's map out a few of these unique structures because they are fascinating. Down on the sweltering coastal plain, the Tihama, you have the rise of the Ziyadid dynasty.
The Ziyadids were nominally Sunni, and they claimed theoretical loyalty to the Abbasids in Baghdad, but in practice they operated as an entirely independent kingdom. They founded the city of Zabid, which grew incredibly wealthy on maritime trade connecting India, Africa, and Egypt.
Zabid became a major hub.
Zabid became so prosperous and culturally vibrant that it earned the nickname the Baghdad of the Yemen.
But the Ziyadid dynasty has an incredible twist ending. By the late 10th century, the Ziyadid rulers grow decadent. They retreat into their palaces and hand over the actual administration and military command to their slaves, specifically elite black military slaves from the Horn of Africa.
Classic historical error. The slaves consolidate the real power. One of these brilliant enslaved commanders eventually assassinates the last weak Ziyadid ruler, takes over the state apparatus, and founds a completely new sovereign dynasty, the Najahids.
And fascinatingly, these former slaves, now kings, continued to aggressively fight for Sunni dominance in the coastal plains. So you have a booming, trade-rich Sunni kingdom ruled by former slaves on the coast. But if you travel just a few dozen miles inland, up the terrifyingly steep mountain passes into the northern highlands, you enter a completely different political universe, the domain of the Zaydi Imamat.
The Zaydi Imamati is one of the most enduring political experiments in history. It was founded in the year 897 by a charismatic religious scholar named Al-Hadi ila al-Haq. He was a direct descendant of Ali, and he practiced Zaydism, a distinct branch of Shia Islam that believes the Imam, the righteous leader of the community, must be a descendant of the Prophet who actively, militarily asserts his claim against corrupt rulers.
But when al-Hadi arrives in the northern mountains of Yemen, he isn't establishing a state as we modern people understand it, is he? He doesn't roll in, build a Capitol building, and start issuing passports.
Not at all. There was no formal bureaucracy, no standing army, and no fixed pattern of royal succession. In fact, al-Hadi was actually invited into the highlands by the warring Yemenite tribes themselves.
Wait, the tribes who hate outsiders and hate being told what to do explicitly invited a foreign religious leader to come live with them. Why?
Because they needed a holy arbiter. The tribes in the north were locked in devastating, endless blood feuds. By tribal custom, you cannot seek mediation from a rival tribe without losing face. You need a neutral third party, someone with unassailable spiritual prestige.
Ah, I see.
Al-Hadi, with his direct bloodline to the Prophet and his immense legal knowledge, was the perfect candidate. His authority rested entirely on his religious aura and his ability to mediate disputes.
But mediation only goes so far, because the sources say that these Zaydi imams who were invited in to bring peace frequently ended up fighting bloody wars against the very tribes that invited them. How does the holy mediator become the enemy?
It comes down to a fundamental, irreconcilable clash between Islamic religious law and pre-Islamic tribal custom. The imams viewed themselves as the enforcers of divine will. They believed it was their duty to implement Quranic law. This meant trying to collect the zakat, the mandatory Islamic wealth tax.
Oh, boy.
It meant trying to enforce strict Quranic punishments for crimes like theft or murder.
Ah, and the tribes who invited a mediator suddenly find themselves being taxed by a guy with no army.
Exactly. The tribes preferred their ancient customary laws known as urf. They were perfectly happy to revere the imam as a holy man when he was settling a dispute over grazing rights. But the moment the imam demanded they hand over their sheep as a religious tax or tried to execute a tribal chief according to the Quran, rather than allowing for traditional tribal blood money, the illusion shattered.
War broke out.
Yes. The history of the Zaidi imams in Yemen is a centuries-long struggle to impose religious order on tribal anarchy, surviving largely on their personal charisma and shifting tribal alliances.
And to survive in this incredibly volatile environment where an imam could be revered on Tuesday and chased out of a valley by angry warriors on Wednesday, they adapted a brilliant, ancient pre-Islamic institution, the Hijra system. Explain how this worked, because it is genius.
It is arguably the most unique feature of Yemenite sociology. The Hajjar were sacred, protected territorial enclaves explicitly established within the lands of the armed tribes.
Think of it like a diplomatic embassy in the modern world. It is a piece of land where the normal laws of violence are entirely suspended by mutual agreement.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. The local tribes, despite their constant warfare, would mutually agree to designate a specific town or valley as a Hajjar. They guaranteed its safety with their own tribal honor. Inside this zone, violence was strictly forbidden. No weapons could be drawn, no blood feuds could be pursued.
So they essentially hotwired an ancient tribal tradition of safe zones to create a theological underground railroad.
Yes. The Zaydis in the north, and later the Ismailis in other regions, used these protected enclaves to shelter their religious scholars. They built libraries, ran massive educational centers, and trained missionaries.
That's incredible.
It allowed them to maintain intense religious and intellectual activity and to slowly spread their sectarian missions without being slaughtered by the warlords fighting just outside the perimeter.
Which brings us to the most incredible, counterintuitive contrast of this entire deep dive. We started this journey looking at the Hijaz, the holy center of the Islamic world. By the 11th century, Mecca is a ruined ghost town of a couple thousand desperate people. The Kaaba has been sacked, the great intellectuals have fled, and pilgrims are being terrorized by local warlords. It is a portrait of complete intellectual and civic collapse.
And yet, down in the Yemen.
Right. Down in the Yemen, which is a fractured, chaotic nightmare of warring tribes, brutal geography, and competing kingdoms, there is an absolute cultural and intellectual renaissance happening.
It is deeply ironic, but it makes historical sense. The intense, unresolvable rivalry in the Yemen is exactly what drove the intellectual boom. You had the Sunni Ziyadids and Najahids in Zabid. You had the Zaydi imams debating theology in their northern mountain enclaves. You had secret Ismaili missionaries operating out of their own sanctuaries. You had the surviving Ibadis deep in Hadramaut.
So many different factions.
There were even entirely homegrown Yemenite sects like the Mutarrifiyya, who combined Islamic theology with Greek natural philosophy.
It's an ideological crucible, because they can't entirely wipe each other out militarily due to the geography. They have to fight with ideas.
Precisely. The ideological warfare required the scholars of every sect to constantly defend, refine, and articulate their beliefs against brilliant opponents. This intense competition produced a vast, magnificent literature. They were writing groundbreaking treatises on jurisprudence, complex theology, poetry, and even astronomy.
So while the centralized symbolic heartland of the Hijaz stagnated into violent obscurity, the fractured, uncontrollable frontier of the Yemen became a golden age of scholarship.
It really did.
So wrapping up this journey and looking at the big picture, the story of the Arabian Peninsula after the imperial capital left is absolutely not a story of sleepy, irrelevant decline. It is a wildly dynamic, often tragic saga. On one hand, you have the Hijaz, trapped in a golden cage, struggling and nearly collapsing under the crushing weight of its own sacred symbolism. It was a place so revered that everyone fought to control it, nearly destroying it in the process.
And on the other hand, you have the Yemen, a region that fiercely resisted imperial control through its punishing geography and its unyielding tribal independence. The empires tried to break it with military force and psychological warfare, but they failed.
And in that failure, the Yemen inadvertently created a fractured but brilliant sanctuary for warring ideas. It forces us to completely reconsider what historical power actually looks like.
Because true power isn't just about where the emperor sits or where the central treasury is located.
Exactly. In the context of the Arabian Peninsula, power was entirely decentralized. It was about who controlled the flow of pilgrims. It was about who commanded the sacred Hijra enclaves. It was about who had the moral authority to dictate the local narratives and mediate the tribal disputes.
The Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad had the massive standing armies, but they could never truly conquer the spiritual gravity of the Hijaz, nor could they break the tribal soul of the Yemen.
Which leaves us with a final thought. I want you, the listener, to address this to yourself as you go about the rest of your day. Think about what happens when a massive idea, whether it is a global religion, a revolutionary technology, or an explosive cultural movement, rapidly outgrows its birthplace.
It's a heavy burden for the origin point.
The original homeland is inevitably left with an almost impossible burden. It remains the symbolic anchor. It becomes the pristine museum that everyone in the world reveres from afar. But stripped of the practical levers of global power, how does any culture survive? How do you maintain your identity when the rest of the world treats your home as a sacred monument, but you still have to wake up and navigate the living, breathing, and often violent reality of actually living there? It is a profound tension between the symbolic and the real, something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.